listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Tuesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over to my YouTube channel as well and watch the video simulcast of this show. That's over at youtube.com/Mr., all spelled out, M-I-S-T-E-R, Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can join the chat room, which is going on right now, inhabited by the fellow Intrepids, our regular listeners to this show. Come on over, meet people. Every day I see somebody new over there. It's kind of neat. So come on over, join the crowd, and if you're overseas and you're not an American citizen, you have to put up with some of the American politic talk that I do on this show, but I don't do a lot of it. If you look back over our last 350 episodes that are all archived right here on the YouTube channel and in other places, you can go check out ODYSY1.com for Odyssey Radio and see some of the other places where the show is archived. You can, in its audio format, by the way, you can see that this show has never been about politics. But because of the elections and things like that, which happened now almost a month ago, we have been talking a little more political at the beginning of the shows than ever before. And that's because this is history that's going on around us. So as I started to say, if you're overseas and you're not an American citizen, you can get a nice inside look into the elections and the outcome and what's going on right now by listening to shows like this one. And we don't spend an awful lot of time on it. And as a general rule, I don't spend a lot of time on politics. But I've spent an inordinate amount of time of late talking about the election, the fallout from the election, the challenge to the election. And so I want you to be a little used to that until you see this all get resolved. And who knows? I may open the door and talk about politics as it pertains to us and our daily lives here in the United States. And of course, what happens to politics in the United States affects every country in the world. If you think the United States is not, maybe your point of view as somebody from outside the country is that the United States meddles in every country. Maybe from the United States point of view, we help every country. We're involved in every country. We look after our interests in every country. What country doesn't do that? And so there it is. It's out there. It's on the platter. And I'm going to present some things every now and then, like I did yesterday. I spent the first half of the show talking about some fallout from the election. And I want to start this, all of that. That's kind of disclaimery type of stuff I just did for you, because I want to start off this show by telling you a little bit about just a little article I saw pop up that I think is worth looking at. And the first thing I want you to notice, remember Joe Biden's first public speech after the media declared him the president-elect. What did he do in that speech? He called for unity. So I typed in, I wanted to find out exactly what he said. So I went to Google, and I said, what has Biden said about unity? And without opening any one of these articles, the first page of 10 articles goes like this. Here's the titles. TheHill.com says Biden calls for unity, healing after capturing the presidency. The New York Times says Biden urges unity. We're at war with the virus, not with one another. The Guardian says, again, we are a house divided. Biden calls for unity. The SCMP.com says U.S. election 2020, Joe Biden calls for healing and unity first. Let's see. Going on, CNBC, Joe Biden urges unity in his first speech as president-elect. Also in this top 10 is Inside Hired, H-I-G-H-E-R-E-D, Inside Hired. Students hope Biden administration's message of unity will... The Hollywood Reporter says Joe Biden offers message of unity as Hollywood responds. Then there's some videos listed here. Watch Biden call for unity in his first speech as president. Time to heal in America. Joe Biden urges unity in his first speech to the American people. Biden calls for unity in a statement after the election call. Then there's two more entries here in the top 10 list. NOLA.com says, in presidential victory speech, Joe Biden calls for unity. And the Washington Post, talk is cheap. Here's what Biden needs to do to be a unity... ... and it cuts off there. I'd have to open that up to see what they had to say about it. And so this is what you're hearing from the Biden camp. If Joe Biden is to actually become president, if he is declared the president of the United States and actually becomes the president-elect, he's got a little sign on his thing when he speaks on his podium that says office of the president-elect. By the way, folks, there is no such office. It has never existed before. That was manufactured as part of the sell job post-election. So anyway, he said from that podium, he talks about unity, unity, unity. And what we've got to do now is focus on unity. And then, now the reason I looked all that up was because I saw an article this morning. And let me see if I can, if I find it or if I just accidentally shut it off here. Hold on a second. Right here. Yeah, here it is. All right. I saw this article and I thought, now this is the left in the media saying these kinds of things. Aren't they the ones that supported Joe Biden? Yes, they are. And they helped get him elected in the media. Yet you hear the media pronounce President Joe Biden, who may become the president-elect, may not, we'll see. You see him calling for unity. Now, let me ask you, get it out of politics for a second. If you are seeking unity, how do you act? If you have a leader that's calling for unity, and you support that leader, how do you act? You seek ways to be unified. Let me ask you something. Does unity have a language? Does being unified together have its own language? Meaning its own lexicon? Meaning, if I am going to say I'm going to work at being unified with those who I was once opposed with, how am I going to talk to those people? How am I going to talk about those people? What am I going to do to put my best foot forward as my leader, who I helped elect, has declared we should do? Fight for unity, reunify this divided nation. How am I going to do that? How do I do that? What's that look like? I can tell you the Daily Beast editor-at-large will show you how he goes about doing that. This is the Daily Beast. He was the editor-at-large, and he goes on this warpath in a chilling editorial that's directed against Trump and Trump supporters. And some might say this kind of invective that he uses is irresponsible. Now, this editor-at-large is Rick Wilson at the Daily Beast. And you can look up the Daily Beast on look up their website, and you'll see the kind of organization they are. And Rick Wilson, the Daily Beast's editor-at-large, says he and presumably others won't forget, quote-unquote, and, quote, won't forgive, quote-unquote, what Trump supporters did to America. In his rant, Wilson also appeared to compare the United States to a cheap hooker that Donald Trump used and abused. What are the details? In a Sunday night editorial, this is 2 days ago now, tagged in his editorial tagged overdue penalties, Wilson said that it's simply not enough to merely enjoy their agony and humiliation. Quote, not enough to merely enjoy their agony and humiliation, end quote. as former Vice President Joe Biden is set to be inaugurated in January 2021. Quote, "It's not enough to hope they'll be shamed and correct their behavior," Wilson added in his short but very pointed remarks. Quote, "The dark is rising for Trump's sycophants, toadies, and enablers. Their tough guy acts and fuck your feelings talk have become a furious whine of complaints and recriminations as a toxic slurry of rage and despair has left a stinging bile in the back of their throats that won't go away. Trump lost, and they can't spin their way past it." End quote. Now, pointing to the Trump campaign's election fraud-related lawsuits against various states, Wilson added, quote, "Even as his lawyers are all but chased out of each town where they file their absurd, doomed lawsuits, the true believers still imagine some miracle emerging from the wreckage of Trump's campaign. The media apparatus that monetized the moronic state of religion of Trumpism is still pumping their slow coach followers full of stupid, easily disproven lies." End quote. Now, Wilson then appeared to compare the country to a cheap prostitute. In concluding his rantings, he said, quote, "The professional class of Republicans, though, know that the bitter end is here, that their dirty half-decade of personal abnegation and degradation is coming to a sick, sad finale," he concluded. "It would leave them with a sense of shame, if they had any. Most of the GOP Inc. types long ago lost that sensibility. Still, America is watching them experiencing a combination of fury and humiliation as Trump heads to the door before even dropping the cash on the nightstand." End quote. So there you are, Americans. Rick Wilson just described you all as a prostitute. If you can take that away from that. Now, that's a cheap shot from me, but isn't that what he's doing here? He's saying that Trump used America like a cheap hooker. Now, those are the words of the Daily Beast's editor-at-large about Trump supporters and those who believe that Trump actually won the election and that there is veracity to the challenge to the election. Now, it's true that there are a lot of lower courts that are looking at the challenges that are being made and dismissing them. Many of them have been dismissed, and there's not like dozens of them, but several of them have been dismissed without even evidence being presented. And I think some of the reasoning behind that is you dismiss that, then it's going to be brought immediately to a higher court on appeal. And they're working their way up to the Supreme Court of the United States to take a ruling on some of this. And if you are on my Facebook page, you can go to my page from this morning, and you can look at a post I put up. Let me see here if I can actually give you the link here. Let's see if I can find it for you. Now, this will be a link that there's an article I saw this morning on. I want to see if it's still there, by the way. Let's see if it's still up. Yes, it is. All right. And this is it's the article's entitled, and I'm just going to leave this with you, and you can go look it up if you'd like. It's entitled "Anomalies in Vote Counts and Their Effects on the Election 2020. A quantitative analysis of decisive vote updates in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia on and after election night." Now, you can go see that article. If I were to click on it here, I can tell you exactly what the link is. Oh, it's a long link. Go over to votepatternanalysis.substack.com. And then there's a long link after that. You'll be able to find it. Or just go to my Facebook page and you can click on it, because I think it's worth looking at. I'm not going to go through it here and now and some of the points he brings up, but if you want to read a very in-depth, technical, a bit daunting read about the election analysis, the numbers analysis, the math, You can go look at that, and you're going to see kind of what we talked about yesterday in the first half of the show, how the election does not add up. And there are so many anomalies and so many holes to poke in the election that it turns one's head. And this is what is being presented to the courts, is going to be presented to the Supreme Court when it reaches there. Especially since they're not getting an opportunity to present all their information up front. So to say this, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but I am one who believes that an election can be manipulated. We, the United States, have manipulated foreign elections. And if you're in one of those countries whose elections we've manipulated, you know what? Yeah, we did it. We did it. We're able to do that. And if we can do it there, we can do it here. The conspiracy comes when you try to figure out who's behind that. Who would have manipulated that? I heard a good quote this morning. It was by Dinesh D'Souza, now a very conservative writer and filmmaker and things like that. And he said, what's very interesting, he says, about the loss of the election by Donald Trump and the Republicans, he said it's because the Republicans focused on the campaign, the Democrats focused on the election. And so it was the Democrats who, for months and months, maybe even a year or so before, started wanting to do things that would affect the election by mail-in voting and all of those things. While the Republicans campaigned to win people's hearts, the Democrats, you notice, how often did you see Joe Biden out campaigning? Not very often, because they knew they had the election in the bag. They were focused on winning the election by any means possible. And so, there it is. Now, I'm just going to throw this little tidbit out there, too, this little bit of raw meat. Imagine what is going to happen to the unity that Joe Biden has been preaching. The unity, we must bring the country back together. What will happen to that unity if the election got overturned? Now, that's a long shot. I still think Joe Biden is going to end up as the president. And in which case, we all need to act like Americans when that happens, whether you support him or not. But what would happen if that election gets overturned? What would you see these people on the left, the Democrats, the liberals, and the far leftists? What will happen if that election gets overturned? What will happen to their calls for unity? Will they still be unified? And I think we get a sneak peek of that by Rick Wilson, the editor-at-large for the Daily Beast. That little information I just shared with you about his editorial, about Trump supporters, about how Trump is, prostituting America, and the sick, twisted stupidity of Trump supporters. I think that's a hint for you at how maybe Joe Biden, all by himself, sitting there alone in his basement, maybe he's a guy that says, I wish we had more unity in this country. Maybe because he is mentally debilitated, which I believe is still true. I don't believe that's changed. He's failing. Maybe he's sitting there thinking, I'm the president. I won the election. It's my job to unify this country now. I think maybe not all the pieces have fit together for him. That's a possibility. And if they have, is he being dishonest with us? But the big question to ask is, how is that unity shown? I started with a question asking you, how would you show other people your language of unity? If you want to be unified with somebody, how do you talk about them? When people in your camp, so to speak, talk negatively about somebody else, when your leader's calling for unity, how do you talk about those people that are speaking negatively? Do you go, hey, you need to shut up over there. That's not what our president-elect is calling for. Or that's not what our leader is calling for. So I need to ask you, what do you feel about How are people on the left, how are Democrats talking to you when you say, well, I believe that the election is questionable? I still support President Trump, and I think that they should still keep this up. How are people responding to you from the left? Remember I said yesterday, if you bring up the fact that you believe the election had fraud or the election had questionable practice, that there were improprieties, what happens? You get degraded immediately. People are trying to take you down, and if their language is not as wholesome as it could be, you get called all kinds of things, like I have, just because I say, look, I think we should play out the challenge. Let's see where it goes. I supported Trump. I'm not a weird, mindless, non-thinking, non-critical sycophant. But I do think that there are questions that need to be asked, and there are things that probably, loopholes that need to be plugged up for future elections, so this kind of thing doesn't happen again, because the anomalies are too great to ignore. So, what is your language of unity? Does it match the media-declared president-elects? Somebody who may end up being your president? Is that the kind of unity he's calling for? Because those who support him have a very different view of what unity is. And that's all I have to say about politics. And again, I used the first half of the show to do that. So let's just take the lesson from that and extrapolate that out. Take it out of politics. How do you talk unity, oneness, togetherness with people? Now, maybe there's a little too much kumbaya to that when we talk about togetherness. And we don't go out to our neighbors in our neighborhood, let's all be together, and let's hug, and let's... No, but we want to get along with people. How do you get along in a society? How do you get along right now? The COVID stuff that's going on. How do you get along with everybody? How do you seek unity in a religious setting, a spiritual setting, a political setting, a community setting? What are the ways to seek unity? And look at what's going on around you in politics and ask yourself, is unity being presented? Is unity being practiced? Or is it just another call word to support where you're going politically, and to make it look like you're this magnanimous thing that you're really not? for hanging on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're joining the second segment of tonight's Intrepid radio program, and you're listening live over on Odyssey Radio. That's ODYSY1.com. Well, you might not be listening live. You might be listening to one of the replays over the next 24 hours from when we broadcast. But at any rate, that's where you are listening audibly. That's ODYSY1.com. Now you can also come over to the YouTube channel and watch the video simulcast of this show and join the live chat room that's going on right now in the show. We're halfway through the show. It's pretty stocked up. There's people talking. And so come on over and join the crowd. That's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join the Intrepids in the Talk channel. Now, we started talking last night about this whole how babies were made in Jesus' time. And when we talked about that, we ended off talking about how did it become possible for some people to entertain simultaneously the notions of this virgin conception and a normal conception for the same person, as reflected in Jesus. How could he be the offspring of God and yet be the male offspring of King David in line to the throne? Was it just a thing of adoption, the way they viewed adoption back then? So in the case of Jesus' Jewish literary accounts of some conceptions, in which part of the male is missing, it preparing the way, envisaging God's involvement in the process of human procreation, Job says this in the book of Job, the earliest book written in the Bible. Did not he who made me in the womb make them? And did not one fashion us in the womb? And the well-known psalm, of course, attributed to David, and this is what we left off on last night. It proclaims, David says, "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance." So as present-day thinkers, we cogitate on some, maybe you don't, maybe this is not an issue for you. By faith, you believe that, well, Jesus was virgin born. And that's what I accepted that for many, many years. But you ask yourself the question, how could he have been virgin born and been fully human, knowing what we know about DNA and how the Y chromosome from the male and the X chromosome from the female make a complete human? We know that now. We didn't know that even 50 years ago. They certainly didn't know that back in Jesus' day. And post the time of Christ when they were writing about these things in the Gospels. So, how did they come to the conclusion that Jesus, well, I know how they came to the conclusion that Jesus was fully human. It's because God made him that way. Boom. God impregnated Eve. And if God created Adam and Eve out of the dust of the ground and breathed into their nostrils the breath of life, and they became a living soul, God could certainly impregnate Mary with the DNA of a human male. But whose DNA is it? It's God created the male. Did he create the offspring of David? Did he use David's DNA to do that? So we tend to assume that this language was understood metaphorically in the time of Christ. And it's simply attributing the whole process in a general way to God as the creative source of life. But the matter may not be so simple. Ancient biology and Jewish theology were not kept in separate spheres, but they intermingled them. They all cross-referenced and crisscrossed each other. So scriptural texts share the dominant Aristotelian view of how conception occurs, but adapt it distinctively so that there are three parties involved: God, the male, and his seed, and the female, with the blood or the fluids of her womb. And all three parties, God, man, woman, are involved and actively involved and understood to be actively involved in the production of the virgin-born human fetus. And so the account of Cain's birth states, "The man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have acquired a man with the Lord." The literal translation from Genesis 4:1-2. And so Cain's conception is a three-party affair. But Eve's pronouncement gives the credit to the divine rather than the human male party. Now, by the way, I have to say on this, and you've heard me talk about it before, when I wrote about the Nephilim, I talked about how Nakosh in the Garden of Eden, one of the Elohim, that he was the one, I believe, that impregnated Eve, but she also had sex with her husband Adam, and she bore twins. One of the sons being Abel was Adam's offspring. One of the sons being Cain was Nakosh's offspring. So perhaps she's talking, and I said rather flippantly, and now I mean this seriously, there were three parties involved in the birth of Cain and Abel, who I believe were twins. And so when that happens, maybe this is what Eve is talking about when she says, God was there, and the man knew his wife, and she conceived it, and I've acquired a man with the Lord, she says. Maybe that's what she's talking about. Now remember when Rachel says to Jacob later on in Scripture, Jacob, the son of Abraham, give me children, Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham, give me children or I shall die. And Jacob angrily responds, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? That's Genesis 30. And later it is, of course, God who heeds Rachel and opens up her womb so that she conceives. That's in Genesis, the latter part of the chapter of 30. Now, the notion of three partners in reproduction is even more explicit in the rabbinic writings that employ and interpret biblical texts. God's active involvement is seen in a particularly striking fashion in the rabbinic text Leviticus Rabbah 14:5. And this text takes Psalm 51:7, and in Hebrew, verse 5 in English, and its statement about David's conception. And it said, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. As well as Psalm 27:10, for though my father and mother have forsaken me, the Lord will take me up. And it explains the passage as follows. David said before the Holy Blessed One, Master of all the worlds, my father Jesse had no intention of having me. He only intended to satisfy his own needs, meaning he wanted to get a little shagging done with David's ma on the side. Now know that this is such because when they were taking care of their needs, one turned his face this way and the other turned her face the other way. And you inserted each and every drop into my mother's womb, like that which David said, through my father and my mother, though my father and mother have forsaken me, the Lord will gather me in. Now that's a rabbinic explanation of Psalm 27. Now here David is being seen as conceived in iniquity. Iniquity. Remember, the church taught for a long time that sex was for one reason, procreation. It wasn't for pleasure. Even though there was pleasure in it, and the pleasure in it was sin. It was sinful to take pleasure in sex. I remember a line from the movie Rob Roy, where Rob Roy's wife is raped by the villain in the movie. And somebody stupidly says to her after the rape, he says, well, it's not a sin if you didn't take any pleasure in it. Of course, she glares at him and he sheepishly goes off. What a stupid thing to have said. But that's the idea, that sex, the pleasure of sex is the sin, or the sin in sex is taking pleasure in it, which I think is absolute nonsense. If God made our bodies, this is a side thing, well, maybe we'll talk about this in full one time. If God made our bodies to enjoy sexual activity, that's not a sin. Moving on. Let's move on. Sorry, Catholics and others who believe that it is. So David is seen as conceived in iniquity. because his parents had no intention of procreating. They were just doing it for the fun of it. They were shagging. I got to tell you, a week ago yesterday at the hotel in Stillwater, the Water Street Inn, where my wife and I went, I had no intentions of creating babies. I was there for fun. But moving on. That might be a little too much TMI for you guys, huh? Come on, admit it. We all have sex for fun. And sometimes a baby comes out of that. Many times babies come out of that. So in this sense, David was forsaken by his father and mother because it was coitus interruptus. They apparently gauged in some form of trying to make sure, maybe he used the withdrawal method because he didn't want to have kids. And in this sense, David was forsaken, as the verse says, by his father and mother. God nevertheless gathered David in, literally by inserting the semen in his mother's womb, according to what the psalm says. So this example graphically conveys the extent to which God's creative activity was envisaged as ongoing and necessary for conception. Yet what's significant about the number of the literary references to conception is that, as in the case of Job 31, which we read earlier, and Psalm 139, it's simply God and the mother's womb with its unformed substance that are mentioned. So when in Judges 13 it says, the angel of the Lord appears to Manoah, to his hitherto barren wife, that's Samson's mom, and he announces, you shall conceive and bear a son. What follows stresses her preparation by refraining from drinking alcohol or eating anything unclean for the conception of the one who will be a Nazarite to God from birth. And the biblical account doesn't mention Manoah's going into her or knowing her, so readers have to fill in the gap and assume that the third party played his appropriate part. But the narrator feels no need to state this. So let's say your child is going to be somebody great and it's ordained by God. Mom bears this great child, and Dad's the third party who just has to inject the seed. So now, not only in the case of Samson, but also in the case of the conceptions of other key figures, the male partner in the reproductive threesome is omitted from the picture. Of the prophet Jeremiah, God says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. That's Jeremiah 1:5. And the servant figure in Isaiah is told in Isaiah 44, verse 2, thus says the Lord who made you, who formed you in the womb and will help you, ... And he goes on to make his statement. So in each case, the life force that generates and develops the fetus in the mother's womb is divine. In emphasizing the divine initiative, any mention of male seed totally disappears from those accounts. Yet we all know these guys all had dads. They all had a sperm donor, if you will, be him an involved dad or an uninvolved dad. And so the fetus develops in the mother's womb, but the male seed disappears from the account. So it's always God who does it. Now, similarly in rabbinic tradition, because of this concern to show God's as active in procreation, what's also noticeable is the extent to which men's contributions through seed are de-emphasized relative to God's. You notice that? Some of these accounts? Have you ever noticed that when looking at Scripture? These are the things that I say, many of us went to church, but many of us didn't really study what we say we believe. Never studied those books. We hear preaching or sermonizing or messages or whatever you want to call them, homilies, but never do we really. One of the things when I was in ministry was the woe is me on a Monday morning, when you'd sit around coffee and you'd talk and you'd say, I wonder how much of the congregation retained what was said yesterday. As a youth pastor, I wonder how many of those kids went home and lived what we taught. Generally, we found that most people forget what's being said in church on Sunday morning by the time they're stuffing their face with popcorn watching the football game that afternoon. They've moved on from it. They go to church to feel good, not to be moved. I want to buy $3 worth of God, please. I want a pound of the Almighty in a paper sack. Not enough to stir my soul or move my spirit, just enough to equal a warm snooze in the sunshine. I want the Almighty in a paper sack for $3 worth of God, please. So one might argue that in light of this literary convention that readers of the Annunciation stories of Jesus' birth, or conception, in Matthew and Luke, with their apparent absence of male involvement, were simply meant to assume such involvement. And these Gospels were following what Scripture had done with many other key figures in Israel's history. They were eluding any mention of the male contribution to the conception of this child who had been elected from the womb in order to stress God's initiative and special purpose for him. So it's more likely, however, that the accounts in Matthew and Luke signal that they have taken the omission of the male one stage further. They make Mary's womb a virginal one. This is Matthew 1:23, Luke 1:34. She has never had intercourse. And the Catholic Church believes that Mary retained the status of a virgin throughout the rest of her life. She had to be a perpetual virgin. She was a perpetual virgin and had no other children. Yet the Bible clearly speaks about Jesus' brothers and sisters, that he had several of them, and they many times accompanied her. Well, they were just stepbrothers and sisters, according to those who push that theory in theology. But they say she never had intercourse. Luke interestingly makes his move while retaining the early proclamation that Jesus was in the physical line of descent from David. He mentions this in Acts 2:30 and 13:23. Luke also includes straightforward references to Joseph as Jesus' father. Luke 2:4 says, "So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth to Galilee to Judea to the city of David, called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and the family line of David." In verse 27, "So Simeon, directed by the Spirit, came into the temple courts. And when the parents brought the child Jesus to do for him what was customary according to the law, and so the child's father and mother, Joseph and Mary, were amazed at what was said about Jesus." And then you go to Luke 48. "When Jesus' parents saw him, they were overwhelmed. His mother said to him, 'Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been looking for you anxiously.'" And then in Luke 4, it says, "All were speaking well of Jesus and were amazed at the gracious words coming out of his mouth. They said, 'Isn't this Joseph's son?'" So those were some of the acknowledgments, even in the book of Luke. Now, present-day readers often find this contradictory, and they seek to explain away one element in favor of the other. But another ancient literary convention, lay at hand, is how widely accepted that, in terms of their genre, the Gospels are best categorized as a subset of ancient Greco-Roman biography. It's also relatively well known that in depicting the beginnings of Jesus' life, the accounts in Matthew and Luke conform very closely to those of the birth of heroes or great figures in ancient biography, where there are predictions, prophecies, omens of their future greatness, and their conception is traced all the way back to a union between one of the gods and a human mother with no human male involved in the process. And what's often not been noticed, however, is that the writers of such biographies were also sometimes content to juxtapose two different sorts of tradition, one natural, the other miraculous, about their subjects' origins, Plutarch's biographies of legendary figures such as Theseus and Romulus contain accounts of both an ordinary human conception and one involving a human mother being impregnated by a god, Poseidon or Neptune in the case of Theseus, and Mars in the case of Romulus. Now, similarly, in Plutarch's biography of Alexander, after first telling how Alexander was believed to be the son of Apollo, who in the form of a serpent lay with Olympias, Plutarch then offers two apparently contradictory reports. In one, Olympias tells Alexander the secret of his divine conception. Then at the time of his first military expedition, she tells Alexander how to behave with the courage suitable to his divine extraction. And in the other report, Olympias denies ever having said anything of the kind, and instead was in the habit of saying, well, when will Alexander leave off slandering me to Hera, the wife of Zeus and the goddess of marriage? Finally, when Olympias' husband, Philip of Macedonia, hears the news of the birth of Alexander, Plutarch relates this in terms of Philip's receiving it with great delight, as would be the true at the birth of his own son. And similar accounts abound in classic Greek and Roman literature. So evidently it's not unusual for ancient readers to entertain simultaneously two different stories about the origins of a great figure. One recounted ordinary physical lineage, the other, suitable in the light of his later heroic achievements, involved a miraculous conception and envisaged him as the son of the gods. Is this what happened with Jesus' conception? Now, this is not of immediate help in interpreting Matthew's story. That version of Jesus' conception doesn't simply have two traditions side by side, but brings the early tradition of Jesus' physical descent from David into line with a miraculous conception by a different route. It stresses that while Joseph was not Jesus' actual human father, he, by naming Jesus, adopts him as his own and thereby enables the child to inherit his Davidic lineage. And you can see this in some of these verses. This is the record of the genealogy, says Matthew. This is the record, Matthew 1:1. This is the record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah. It goes down through this genealogy to David and eventually to Jesus. But such a linkage isn't part of Luke's story at all, where Mary is the parent who is to do the naming. It says in Luke 1:31, "Listen, you will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus," is what the angel told her, Gabriel. So instead, like the biographical accounts that we've discussed already, Luke and Acts, Luke wrote the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts, if you didn't know that. Luke and Acts juxtaposes two different perspectives. One, a virginal conception in the Annunciation story. And that's Luke 1:26-28. It says, in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph, a descendant of David, and so on and so forth. And the tradition number 2, that Jesus was the seed of David through Joseph. This is in Luke 3:23. So Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years old. He was the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Mehat, the son of Levi, the son of Melchi, the son of Janai, the son of blah, 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 onward, and it goes all the way back to David, the king. So what may appear on a present-day reading to be a blatant inconsistency can now be seen as in line with the literary conventions of some ancient biographies, in which giving dual paternity was one way of treating the birth of those who were perceived to have achieved greatness in their later lives. So early Christians believed that the mission and death of Jesus had been vindicated through God's raising him from the dead and establishing him as the Son of God, the resurrection, who ascended to the right hand of the Father. You can find this in Romans 1, 3 through 4, concerning his Son, who was a descendant of David, with reference to the flesh, who was appointed the Son of God in power, according to the Holy Spirit by the resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Notice that phrase that Paul used there when writing this. He's talking about the Son, the descendant of David, with reference to the flesh, who was appointed the Son of God in power, according to the Holy Spirit, by the resurrection. So they're saying the resurrection is what made him the Son of God. That's what Paul was saying. And so this describes God's Son, who was descended from David, according to the flesh, designated the Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead. Luke's Annunciation story retrojects this future greatness of Jesus, the son of Joseph, to his conception, and it depicts him as the Son of God from the very beginning of his earthly life as a direct result of Mary being empowered by God's Spirit. Now, in the New Testament, we have the tradition that Jesus was physically descended from David through Joseph, as his natural father, found in writers like Paul. That's in Romans 13. You can look these up. I give you these references so you can look them up if you want to. You got to be jotting down notes. 2 Timothy 2:8. Also, it says, remember, Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, a descendant of David, such is my gospel. That's 2 Timothy. And it's also in John. And we have a story of a virginal conception in Matthew. So if any ancient biography indicates how someone born without a human father could still be considered human, ancient biography and its adaptation by Luke show how a conception with and a conception without a human male's involvement could both be attributed to the same person, the same subject. In so doing, Luke indicates that any of his readers aware of the separate traditions had a means of interpreting them in combination that could do justice to what each was saying about the identity of Jesus. We're almost done here. We only got a minute or so left here of the show. And I do want to mention that this whole idea of Jesus acquiring or becoming knowledgeable of his position as the Son of God was something that came later, or was even after the death, perhaps after the resurrection. Was Jesus born of a virgin, meaning there was no male involvement, only God? Or was it like so many other literary conventions of the day and the time, that the greatness of somebody was God-breathed? It was breathed by God. It was breathed by the gods. It was something that made this person God, the sons of God. Yet they had dads too. Philip of Macedonia was the dad of Alexander the Great. Yet his mom said he was conceived by the gods, Apollo. So this is an interesting way, I think, to start looking at Jesus. Was he born of a virgin? Or was she truly just the young woman, as the Hebrew states, who bore the Son? Maybe she did have an angelic visitation. Maybe Jesus did actually resurrect from the dead, and that is what made him the Son of God. But was he actually the flesh and blood son of Joseph? Remember, the story says that Joseph, when he found out she was pregnant, he was going to divorce her because he was like, I've never had sex with this woman. Remember that? He was going to put her away, it says, quietly, because he didn't want to embarrass her. He didn't want to have her killed. He didn't want to have any of that happen. He just wanted to put her away, probably to avoid the embarrassment of the woman I'm betrothed to had sex with somebody and she's having a baby, and it ain't mine. That's why all that is there. And the angel came to him, remember, and said, the child that's in her womb is mine. It's the Son of God. So was that an invention, or was that part of the story? That's an interesting question to ask. What is convention and context of the day? What is actual spiritual activity? We'll never know the answer to that, but we can look at this stuff and start to figure out, literally, how that could have been constructed. There it is. It's all we got time for tonight, folks. We're going to go out for a 23-hour break, and we'll be right back, so you sit tight. Have a good night.